When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of ShopPay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
At Blinds.com, it's not just about window treatments. It's about you, your style, your space, your way. Whether you DIY or want the pros to handle it all, you'll have the confidence of knowing it's done right. From free expert design help to our 100% satisfaction guarantee, everything we do is made to fit your life and your windows. Because at Blinds.com, the only thing we treat better than windows is you. Visit Blinds.com now for up to 45% off select styles, plus a free professional measure. Rules and restrictions apply.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For all the stories of bravery and heroism that came out of the American Revolution, the success or failure of the Patriots' efforts to secure independence from Great Britain ultimately depended on having the funds to be able to field an army. For that, General Washington and the Continental Congress turned to a Philadelphia merchant named Thomas Willing. His story is one that is not often told, and in exploring his history, we gain a richer understanding of the history of the Revolution and the early Republic. Before I get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. My guest for this episode, Richard Vague, just published a book entitled The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy, 1731 to 1821. Richard previously served as the Secretary of Banking and Securities for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and has engaged in entrepreneurial ventures, served on the boards of the University of Pennsylvania and Penn Medicine, and helped to shape financial policy through his roles in organizations like Pennsylvania's largest public pension fund. In addition to his various speaking engagements, Richard is also the author of The Paradox of Debt, The Case for a Debt Jubilee, and An Illustrated Business History of the United States. More information about Richard, as well as a link to purchase a copy of his book for your very own, can be found on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. We had a fantastic conversation about Thomas Willing and his contributions to the Revolutionary War effort, as well as his leadership of the First Bank of the United States. And I cannot thank Richard enough for his time and the insight that he provided. Thus, without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to our discussion.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Listening to this podcast? Smart move. Being financially savvy? Smart move. Another smart move? Having State Farm help you create a competitive price when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the personal price plan. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us on the Presidencies podcast.
It's an honor to be here. You've got a great podcast, and it's a privilege to be part of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And as we were talking about right before we started recording, your work with this book, it really gets to the heart of one of the key aspects of what I try to do with presidencies is trying to understand these figures that may not be quite as well known to the general public and that had a massive impact on American history. And I think with your book, you do that quite well. And so just to get us started, let's go ahead and start with Thomas Willing's early life and his early start in business, working with his father's mercantile firm. what does Willing's early career tell us about how he would approach both business and political matters over the course of his life?
Well, first and foremost, his family was from England. Now, they came there. His father had established a business in the America. And Willing himself, Thomas Willing, was born in America, but he went back to England to go to school. He went to the Watts Academy and the Inner Temple. So their roots in England were very, very deep. And, that was a period of history when America was booming. It was the biggest boom economically in world history. And from 1700 to 1800, America grew from, 250,000 people to 5 million. And the economy went from essentially nothing to a third of mighty Britain's. So a lot of what they were doing was just riding that economic wave. And his family and he were merchant traders really taking part in the unprecedented boom of the Atlantic Triangle of trade.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that, and we'll talk about this more because one of the things that I appreciated about your work was that you help us to get a sense of scope, help us to understand just how massive this was, this growth, and just kind of the scope of all of this. And the fact that Willing was a part of this and his family was tied into this is just amazing.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the part of the way the revolutionary story is told is, you have this beleaguered hovel of virtuous Americans versus and this indomitable Britain. But that kind of wasn't the case because America was getting as strong or stronger than Britain in many respects. And it was improbable that something as robust. One commentator called America Hercules in a cradle. And it was improbable that it would continue to subordinate itself if it was becoming that powerful.
Absolutely. And you highlight how these business leaders, how merchants were involved in this. And, Willing, of course, is one of those. And you note in your book Willing's early rise to political prominence, which was then brought to a halt early in the revolution. So, Richard, what happened to cut short Willing's political leadership in Pennsylvania, and how did he respond to this?
Well, he had become, one of the dominant political leaders of Pennsylvania. He had been mayor of Philadelphia. He was a standout legislator as part of the assembly. He was a Supreme Court justice. So he was at the pinnacle. And then he voted against the Declaration of Independence on July the 2nd of 1776. And it turns out that most of Philadelphia's elite voted against the Declaration of Independence. And it further turns out that the Assembly, the state government of Pennsylvania, had prohibited the delegates from voting for independence. So what we uncover is this virtual civil war, at least this political civil war that was emerging between wealthy merchants in the coastal cities of the U.S., especially Philadelphia, and these Scotch-Irish Presbyterian middling and lower sorts that were pouring into the country and were becoming the farmers and artisans and mechanics. And these two groups were very much in opposition to each other. And that's an undertold, if not untold, story of the revolution. And obviously, those middling and lower sorts won out in this situation. And we voted for independence. And, the rest is, in a profound way, is history.
Definitely. Well, and it was interesting as you went along in your work that, this vote against the Declaration kept coming back, by detractors of Willing. And likewise, when he remained in Philadelphia, when the British took over that city, these things kept being brought back. Of course, and as we'll talk more about, he would find new ways to lead. But the fact that this kept coming back and being a point of attack for him when, as you said, it was circumstances really, but it also highlights this division within not just Pennsylvania, but, in various parts of what became the United States.
Yeah, I mean, we simplify history in the retelling, but at that moment, you had loyalists, those that went, up and down the board, went with England, and Willing was not one of those. And then you had the folks that hated England, that desperately wanted to be separate from England. And then you had, at least a third of the people in the country that were in the middle and really didn't know what to do and how to proceed. And, Willing was primarily interested in protecting his family and his business. And it was difficult to navigate that. And, as time evolved, the folks that had championed the Declaration of Independence became the heroes. And those that had been less decisive really had that mark upon their resumes. And he tried to explain that, including in his autobiography, but his behavior. Once it became clear that America was going to go its own path, he got on board and he helped save the revolution in its earliest days by procuring gunpowder. And his firm was, better positioned than any in the country to get gunpowder. And if we hadn't had gunpowder in those first few months, we'd have lost the revolution right there. So, he got on board and he became one of the most effective patriots, if you will, but only after he had voted against the Declaration.
And I think that's one thing that you highlight. We do think, the history books are full of the battles, the generals, the leaders. And there are these folks behind the scenes who are making sure that they had supplies, making sure that they had funds to be able to put these armies out in the field, to be able to actually fight. And without people like Willing, none of the other would have happened.
Well, that's exactly right. And you see that in the quotes of the revolutionary leaders, including George Washington himself, who says, the side that's going to win is the one that has, quote, the longest purse. And, it became clear through time that America didn't have to win the war. America simply needed to avoid losing the war. The cost to the British was 3.5 times greater than the cost to the colonies. And that alone made it improbable that Britain was going to win that war. And in fact, from the very beginning, there's a huge constituency within Britain that doesn't want the war and is against it and sees it only as a source of higher taxes. So, Willing and his friends acted to help fund the war. And one of the ways they did this, there was a point where continental currency, we all know that continental currency got really worthless really fast. People were using it as, decorations for their hats. It was so worthless. And at that point in time, Willing and his friends came in and chartered the first bank ever in the United States. It was called the Bank of North America. And Hamilton, who's very young and sitting on the sidelines, with of the financial world at this point, rejoices, saying, with this bank, there's no way we can lose our independence. And so that becomes the way that Willing and his colleagues make an enormous contribution to the revolution and to the establishment of the country.
Well, and that really became, Willing's niche of how he would help to lead this new nation, would help to serve the new nation, because you mentioned that he served as president of first the Bank of North America, but then the even larger bank, the Bank of the United States, which we've talked about on the podcast, and that these positions, these leadership positions in these key banks afforded Willing a good deal of clout and influence over public affairs. So, would you mind telling us more about Willing's approach to leading these two banking institutions and how he ended up coming to act, as you described him, quote, like a central banker for the United States?
Well, as we just said, he, helped found and then led the Bank of North America, and that helped fund the revolution. And it really helped fuel the growth of the country in the tumultuous 1780s. And then, as we know, the moment came that they chartered, or they created, a constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. And that was 1787. And Washington gets sworn in 1789. And almost immediately, they create something called the Bank of the United States to help with the country's debt and to help with the financing of the government, and to really provide the fuel for the growth of the country. And of course, they picked Thomas Willing to be president of this bank. And it's an enormous bank. When they charter it, it has more capital than all the other banks in the country at that moment. And by the end of its first year, it has issued more loans than the rest of the country had issued heretofore at that time. So it doubled the amount of lending in the country. So he was very powerful. And one of the ways that that manifested itself is folks were hesitant to vote against Willing's positions because they were afraid of being refused loans at the bank. And you see this in the correspondence of the time. I mean, he's feared, not because he's a mean guy, because we know he's a gracious guy, but if you have a business that's dependent on loans and he might turn you down, you pay attention. So his influence helps ensure the ratification of the Constitution. And that was a vitriolic battle, as you may recall.
Yeah.
It was not assured that the Constitution would get ratified. And then things like the Jay Treaty, which are important for keeping the peace at a fragile moment in American history. Willing helps ensure that that gets ratified. So, he becomes very, very powerful, very feared. And in fact, that's why the Anti-Federalists had been afraid of the bank to begin with, is they didn't want that much clout to be resident in a single institution.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because this goes into that larger discussion, and that discussion, in the drafting of the Constitution about, having a strong executive and this fear of giving too much power to one person. But you also see it, it's not just political power, it's, banking, financial power as well. There's this fear, and you see it like with the military as well. Folks fear a standing army. There's this fear of too much power being consolidated in any one place in various components of society.
Yeah, without question. Jefferson's party, the Republicans, or the Anti-Federalists as they're called, are perfectly content with power remaining in the states. That's been true for 100 years. They saw no reason for that to change. And yet the Federalists, for a variety of reasons, want centralized power. And one of the reasons they want centralized power is to help refund war debt, as we learn in the book. But yeah, it was massively powerful. And 20 years later, and this is after Willing has retired, the charter for the Bank of the United States expires, and the Anti-Federalists are still there, and they still fear the bank. And in fact, the bank's charter is not renewed in 1811, which creates another set of problems, like how do we fund the War of 1812? But that's another story for another day.
Absolutely. It's one that we've covered on presidencies, and it is a fascinating story. It is kind of mind-boggling that we went to war without a means of actually funding it, but, things happen.
That doesn't seem to stop us from doing anything.
No, it doesn't. But, some of these arguments for the bank, and it was this scope, like you said, being able to offer all these loans, being able to kind of kickstart the economy. And that was a power, it could be a strength, but also, as you described in your work, quote, the launch of that bank, the Bank of the United States, because of its sheer size, would overwhelm the nascent U.S. economy. So we've talked a little bit about this, but could you help us to better understand the scope of the Bank of the United States in the economy of the time, the early challenges it faced, and what lessons Willing had to learn taking up the presidency of that institution?
Banking was a brand new thing in the United States, and it was still a relatively new thing in the world economy. The whole era began, in my view, in 1694 with the Bank of England. So folks were still learning about the power of lending and, how dangerous too much lending can be. And by the way, we're still learning that lesson. We had to
Yes.
learn that lesson in 2008. So it's clearly one that folks aren't learning well enough, soon enough. But in Willing's day, as we mentioned a moment ago, the loans from the new bank, the Bank of the United States was gargantuan in size relative to the economy. And it was, it was bigger than all the other banks combined. And it lends in a way that doubles the amount of loans in the economy within the first 12 months. Within the first 2 months, it's increased the loans in the country by 50%. It's astonishing in retrospect. Well, that lending is like jet fuel for the economy. But as we know, too much can be a bad thing. And a lot of the loans are being used to speculate. So folks are borrowing from the bank to buy the new U.S. Treasury bonds and the stock of the new companies like the Bank of the United States itself. And almost immediately, we have a huge boom followed by a crash. And that's in 1791. So what I say is United States is the United States from the very beginning. We're prone to boom, we're prone to bust, and in the middle of it all, we're growing like a weed. So, in 20 years, the U.S. doubles in size. This is during Willing's tenure, but the economy gets ahead of itself. And, we have a crash in 91, we have another crash in 92. Then we have a huge land crash in 96. And what Willing learns is how powerful lending is. And as the nation's first banker, it's a really important lesson. And the truth is, the bank survives essentially unscathed. And really, so does the U.S. economy during this period. And I think it's learning from those early over-lending scenarios is what helps Willing become more and more conservative and better banker.
Well, and it's interesting. And, like I was telling you, I've had to learn a great deal about the history of banking in the United States, about, economic trends as part of my work with the podcast. And, one of the things that you brought up in your work that was fascinating to me is the difference between economic crises that are more focused in the banking realm and trading versus like the land crises. That was fascinating to me. And, it definitely made me think and rethink what I've learned.
Well, first of all, kudos to you for being astute enough to focus on this dimension of history, because a lot of historians don't. And as we all know, money makes the world go round. So, but it's even true today. The worst crises in U.S. history and really global history have all been associated with real estate lending, because for the very simple reason that real estate lending is 5 to 10 times greater than any other kind of lending. And, it's true in the Great Depression. That's a real estate crisis. '08 was obviously a real estate crisis, a mortgage lending crisis. Well, that's true in Willing's day as well. The crises of 91 and 92 really relate strictly to stocks and bonds, primarily of bank stocks and U.S. Treasury securities. Those are bad, but they recover really in a matter of months. By the time you get to 96, it's the first massive land speculation, and people are buying millions of acres of land on credit. And Willing's partner, Robert Morris, does a lot of this. And in fact, it brings the division between the two, because Willing's much more conservative. And Morris ends up in debtor's prison. He buys lots of land and he can't pay the taxes and he can't sell it and he can't make the interest payments. And it's not just Morris, it's a lot of folks. And that's the first really big crisis in U.S. history. And Willing manages through it, comes through it smelling like a rose, but a lot of folks' lives and careers are ruined.
Well, and like you said, it's one of those things we see, the echoes of history that, this isn't the last time that we have these real estate speculation bubbles that burst. And it's fascinating to see why these things start up and how they progress. And we'll talk more about Robert Morris in a minute, because he is a fascinating figure and definitely a key figure in Willing's life and career and in the history of the United States. But that was one thing that really interested me about your work, because while this is a biography of Thomas Willing, in many ways, it's also a story of so many other individuals whose lives and fortunes were interwoven with Willing's. No man is an island. So I was wondering, what insight does studying Willing's close personal, political, and business relationships provide us about him and his importance to American history? And who was the most fascinating individual in Willing's life that you learned about during the course of your research?
Well, you have to say Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, of course, is this brilliant, shooting star in American history. And they first encounter each other when Hamilton is a precocious 16-year-old working in the Caribbean, St. Croix, where he was born. And you see correspondence between Thomas Willing, who is then 41 and already the dominant merchant trader among the colonies. And it's about trading wheat flour, which is kind of part and parcel as to what both Hamilton and Willing are doing at that time, and, kind of portends the future. And it, by the way, helps explain why Hamilton was so knowledgeable about these things. He's at the time that I was reading comic books, he's exchanging currencies, he's trading commodities, and becoming quite expert at it. His adult partners basically turned the firm over to him, and he's doing a brilliant job. And, their lives remain intertwined. Hamilton would actually live across the street from Willing in Philadelphia when he becomes Secretary of the Treasury. And they dine, Hamilton dines at Willing's house and at William Bingham's house, who's Willing's son-in-law, all the time. And they become very, very close. This is in Philadelphia. This is a 2-block stretch that I argue is the most important 2-block stretch in American history. It's Spruce to Walnut to Chestnut on 3rd Street. And you have Hamilton, Willing, George Washington lives there for a time. The Bank of the United States is headquartered there. The Treasury Department is headquartered there. So, it's an amazing stretch of geography. Well, Hamilton not only lives there and dines with Willing and Bingham and others there, he conducts his notorious affair with Maria Reynolds while he's there. And Willing is Hamilton's loan officer. I tend to think of that relationship as being the pivotal relationship in American government at that moment. Hamilton borrows from Willing immediately to meet payroll, upon taking the job. And then he borrows for the various needs of the U.S. government, including war, including the financing of the putting down of the Whiskey Rebellion. It's a relationship where they basically invent the American financial system and work, frankly, very seamlessly to create the financial systems of the United States.
Well, and that was a fascinating part of your book. And for our listeners, I definitely recommend reading in detail, your book, because you really help us to understand, because there's so much emphasis on Hamilton and Hamilton's plan. It was dependent on these loans. Like you said, he came to office and he's like, oh, we've got nothing. We need to borrow money just to be able to keep the doors open. And Willing had that power, you described, when he called in the loan on the United States, that he was willing to say, what, fork it up because, you owe me. And it's amazing to get that perspective from the story that isn't often told, but is key to understanding just how fragile and being shaped this period of American history and our government was.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Bank of the United States is funded by private investors. And people are astonished by that fact because in today's world, any new department of government is going to be funded by the government. Government's got ample capacity to do anything. Well, in 1789, the United States government didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And it was inconceivable that it could put together the $10 million to fund the Bank of the United States. It's stock that sold to individuals create the Bank of the United States. So Willing's kind of in the driver's seat. And over the early course of his career, he actually, as you just pointed out, he actually turns down the United States for a couple of loans, which is inconceivable today. And as best I can tell, he's the only person who ever had that power. And he did it basically by saying to the United States government, get your act together, fund these deficits other ways, or mind the store a little better. And then at one moment, as you just mentioned, he actually calls the government's loan and makes them repay a loan. It's just inconceivable today, but that's the amount of power that Thomas Willing had. And that's the conservative approach he took that I think was key and pivotal in America's early financial life.
Definitely. Well, and speaking of somebody who took a different approach, wasn't quite as conservative, we mentioned him earlier, Robert Morris. This was a particularly notable relationship, their long term partnership and Willing's friendship with Morris. And Morris is the man who's been dubbed the financier of the revolution. So, what can you tell us about this relationship between Willing and Morris? And why do you believe Morris is more well known than Willing when, as you highlight in your work, Willing contributed just as much, if not more, in many ways, to the establishment of the United States?
Well, Robert Morris is a dazzling presence in revolutionary history. As you pointed out, he gets named superintendent of finance in the American Revolution. He has this hand in glove relationship with George Washington. If you study Washington's correspondence, he's writing Morris asking for more money almost continuously. But if you go into Robert Morris's roots, he had actually gone to work for Thomas's father when Morris was only 15 years old as an apprentice. And he became Thomas's employee. Thomas is 3 years older than he is. And so they're both teenagers together, basically. And then when Thomas turns 22, his father dies unexpectedly. So there he is alone with the largest merchant trading firm in the country and overwhelming responsibility. And he relies on Morris. And Morris becomes his employee. They become very close. And very quickly, his reliance on Morris is such that he promotes him to equal partner. So the firm, if you read any of these histories, it's always Willing, Morris and Company. So, you can almost read the entire biography of Morris and barely know that Willing exists, but you certainly see that the firm is called Willing, Morris and Company. Well, this is at a point, because of the vote on independence, that Morris is taking more of the public-facing role within the firm, and Willing has, withdrawn back to the guts of the business and is running, kind of the credit and the operating side of the business. But they made an unstoppable combination. Morris was, kind of this life of the party, wheeler dealer guy, and those attributes served him extremely well. And that's what it took to finance. Took baling wire metaphorically to piece together the financing of the American Revolution. And his temperament was ideally suited to that. Thomas Willing is the more buttoned down, but you can see that partnership worked very, very well. And they increased the size of Willing's father's firm by 70 times in the 20 years they're together. I mean, it's almost unfathomable that they go from like this firm with 3 ships to a firm with dozens of interests in dozens of ships, either directly or indirectly. I think Robert made Willing's life more exciting. I think Willing made Robert's life more grounded. But eventually, after about 20 years, really starting in the revolution itself and afterwards, they began to split apart, and they actually dissolved the partnership briefly during the revolution, then again permanently in 1793. And it's because Morris has just gotten more and more aggressive and speculative, and Willing is not, pardon the pun, is unwilling to become that speculative, and they part ways. And Morris begins doing deals on a massive scale. He ends up owning, on credit, 6 million acres probably in terms of land across the United States, huge swaths of Western Pennsylvania and New York and Georgia and the like. He ends up entering into international deals. He gets a deal where he has the a contract to supply all tobacco to France,
Wow.
the entire country of France.
Wow.
The problem is he makes this deal at a price below the current market price of tobacco. So he gets into trouble deeper and deeper and deeper. He forms a company and buys up most of the land in the new city of Washington, D.C., and he ends up in debtor's prison. There's a couple of very poignant stories. I mean, his creditors are hounding him. He holds up in his country home because creditor can't go into the home to arrest someone. So you have this picture of him inside his home on Lemon Hill here in Philadelphia with dozens of creditors waiting to pounce on him if he emerges. And he finally does give himself up. He goes to debtor's prison right next to Independence Hall, at 5th and Walnut. And the most poignant moment there is when his old friend and collaborator, George Washington, comes and has dinner with him in prison. But he dies penniless, and Willing dies a millionaire.
Yeah, and it really speaks to, that's one thing that comes across in your work and in your research that, Willing and you do see, at times Morris kind of pulls Willing a little more out of that conservative shell to take chances, but there's a line for him. He knows where the line is and how far to go, and Morris just didn't. And like you said, it became a problem and it sent their lives on different trajectories.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And it speaks to, the opportunities, but also the pitfalls, because we see the story of Robert Morris play out with other figures in American history at this time. Like you said, with this land speculation and the bust, Morris had a big role in it, but there are others who fell victim as well. You had some folks who were able to pull themselves back, but you have some folks that are just devastated by this.
It's unbelievable how much of that occurs so early in American history. There are winners and losers, and some lives end up as victories and some lives end up as tragedies. And Morris and Hamilton and even William Bingham, who's one of the characters of the book, end up with lives that have tragic circumstances. And that itself is a lesson. And, that's something we learn from history.
Yeah. But you see with Willing that here is somebody who can adapt, who can survive. And you see that, with the changing of the political tides of the nation, because despite his close ties to the Federalists, Willing was able to maintain close working ties with the new administration when Jefferson became president in 1801. So can you tell us about Willing's relationship with Jefferson and how he was able to keep in the good graces of this incoming administration?
Well, it's a great question. Willing served under 3 presidents. He served under Washington, who was his close friend and next door neighbor for a period. He served under Adams. Then he serves under Thomas Jefferson. And Adams and Washington were aligned with Willing in being pro-bank and pro-federalist. And Jefferson is, of course, on the opposite side of the spectrum. He was an opponent of the bank. He was the opponent of the bank. And so when he took over as president, there was every expectation that he would shut the bank down, that, all that Willing had built up to that point would be for naught. But he didn't. And, one of the things that happens is he appoints this gentleman named Albert Gallatin to be Treasury Secretary. And Albert Gallatin may be the greatest Treasury Secretary in American history. He's certainly the longest serving. His statue and Hamilton's are the 2 statues outside the Treasury today. But he serves intelligently. He and Willing learn to get along very, very well. They act together to get the economy out of trouble on a number of occasions. It's a really positive relationship. But one of the interesting things at that time is that Jefferson, who of course loves Monticello and Virginia, but as president, he's a resident of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is really largely a Federalist town at that point in time. So Jefferson, in a real sense, is in hostile territory. And, something I didn't appreciate until we did the research is that, he's actively shunned by Federalist society. So, not that he was that social to begin with himself, but he's not invited to the parties and he's treated rudely. As president, he's treated rudely in Philadelphia, except by Willing and his son-in-law Bing. And Willing is fundamentally a gracious individual. And, irrespective of his power, he conducts himself graciously and honorably and continues to extend invitations out to Jefferson. And Jefferson remembers that. He and Gallatin both comment on that. And, you end up with a successful symbiosis between the federal government and the bank as a result of that. And, the other one other thing that you get into is that Jefferson was really good friends with Willing's daughter. And Willing's daughter is Anne Willing Bingham, who becomes viewed as the most beautiful woman in all of Europe and America. She's the leader of not just Philadelphia, but North American society. And Jefferson and Anne Willing Bingham have this beautiful correspondence that is about really lofty things like the, women's place in society and, very elevated subjects. And Anne Willing Bingham argues, forcefully for women getting respect and participating in political conversations. And Jefferson is really respectful of her as a result of that, but he hates her husband. And you know how Jefferson could hate people.
Oh,
And,
yes.
and he, so, there's all dimensions to this relationship. But at the end of the day, I think the lesson is treat people with respect. Irrespective of how much you differ with them politically, we all need to abide by the golden rule.
Well, and it gets back to this idea of Thomas Willing being this businessman, of understanding you've got to work with people and you don't always get to choose the people that you have to work with. You just have to figure out how to make it work. And that comes across in your work that he was very skilled at doing that, and that leads to his success.
I think that's well said.
Well, Richard, as we wrap up our conversation, could you share with us what's been your biggest takeaway from your research into Willing's life and career? And why do you feel it is important for our listeners to learn more about Thomas Willing?
Well, I mean, it was a journey for me, and it took me, into the story of America's founding and made me realize it's a much more complicated story than, our high school and college textbooks led us. And I think because it is a more complicated story, there's more to learn from it. It's more real, it's more true, and it's more reflective of conflicts that we have today. I think today we see this. One of the big strands of American politics is the so-called coastal elites versus middle America. Well, that's abundantly present from the very beginning in Thomas Willing's life. And as you mentioned, they navigated that by adapting. There's two ways you can approach that. One of them is just to dig in and, get increasingly antagonistic. And the other way is to try to find a way forward. So I think by studying his life, we can have an understanding of the roots of that conflict and, how best to navigate it. I think we learn a lot about economic history from this. I mean, I'm astonished. I had actually written a book about financial crises globally, and I had gone all the way back to 1820, but didn't try to go back further than that. And sure enough, we've got our first crises, and they're identical in substance and form with the crises that we have today. And I think there's so much to be learned about crises, as you've already pointed out in your commentary today. So, the more I spend with, economic stories of the past, the more I think that some of these guys knew more about economics than we know today. So, but I think most importantly, by studying his life, we can learn much about adapting and moderation and compromise, because Willing embodied that American trait that has been most important to our success as a nation, the ability to compromise and move forward. And we saw that with his vote on independence, and then he adapted and got right on board and moved forward. We saw that in his, the navigating the differences between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. We see it again and again and again. And I think that lesson is even more important today than ever. And frankly, to study Willing's life is to have a more profound understanding of America itself.
Agreed. And for our listeners, that's something that we cover on the Presidency's podcast. We try to get to the more complicated stories because those are the human stories. That helps us to better understand it's not clear cut, and there are amazing stories and examples out there. And I have no doubt that our audience would appreciate this new, fresh look at the early days of the United States. The book is The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy, 1731 to 1821. Richard, thank you so much for joining us on Presidencies, and thank you so much for your research. This was a fascinating read, and I can't recommend it enough. So thank you so much.
I'm so grateful to you. It's been a privilege to be on your show.
Thanks so much again to Richard Vague for his time and the insight that he provided about Thomas Willing and his role in U.S. history and in helping to establish a new nation on a firm financial footing. Richard's book is The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy, 1731 to 1821. And I highly recommend you pick up a copy, as Richard goes into further detail than we had time to discuss in our conversation. I'll have a link to more information on Richard, as well as how to purchase a copy of his book on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. Thanks so much to our patrons, whose financial support ensures that I have the equipment and resources needed to keep this good work going. As a token of my appreciation, all patrons get access to an ad-free feed for the podcast, which also includes some special patron-exclusive episodes. I just finished up a series on the Postmasters General prior to the office becoming a cabinet-level post. And next up, I'm going to share some outtakes from the Calhoun episode. That's right. Despite going for 3 episodes and over 4 hours, there was still material from the Calhoun outline and research that ended up on the cutting room floor. And I can't wait to share that with our patrons. If you'd like to become a patron of the Presidencies podcast, just go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up. If you're not able to commit to a monthly donation, there are other ways you can support the podcast. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidenciespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidencies podcast. If you'd like to reach out to me, please feel free to email me at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on social media if you don't follow me there already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Rinse knows that greatness takes time, but so does laundry. So Rinse will take your laundry and hand-deliver it to your door expertly cleaned. And you can take the time pursuing your passions. Time once spent sorting and waiting, folding and queuing, now spent challenging and innovating and pushing your way to greatness. So pick up the Irish flute or those calligraphy pens or that daunting beef Wellington recipe card and leave the laundry to us. Rinse. It's time to be great.